The fluorescent lights hummed their electric dirge as Elena Martinez pushed through the ER doors at Sacred Heart Hospital, her scrubs wrinkled from a 16-hour double shift, her dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Norfolk humidity had turned her white coat grey at the collar. Her left leg moved a half-second slower than her right, compensation for an old wound, the kind that never quite forgave you for surviving what should have killed you. She didn't limp. Limping was admitting something. Instead, she moved with the kind of efficiency that came from operating in kill zones, every step economical, every motion purposeful. The antiseptic smell of the hospital wrapped around her like something familiar. Underneath it, she caught the sharper notes, fresh blood, saline solution, the metallic tang of fear that no amount of bleach could scrub away. In the locker room, before clocking in, Elena's fingers found the zipper to her personal locker. She opened it and touched the pair of worn combat boots sitting on the bottom shelf, their leather cracked and weathered, caked with dried sand the color of old blood. Desert sand. Tikrit sand. The kind that got into everything and never left your bones. She didn't pull them out. She never did. Just one fingertip against the rough leather, a ritual that took 3 seconds. A talisman. Then the metal door clicked shut, and the boots disappeared back into darkness where they belonged. The ER at Sacred Heart was controlled chaos, a ballet of monitors and alarms and the particular kind of tension that only emergency medicine created. Nurses moved like they had trained for years, which they had. Doctors barked orders. Patients groaned behind curtains. A monitor beeped its steady rhythm down the hallway, a patient's heartbeat on display for anyone with ears to witness. Elena took her position at the nurse's station, her hands moving across the keyboard with the precision of someone who had sorted information under pressure before. Vital signs. Medications. Patient charts. Data was data, whether it came from a monitor or a radio crackled with incoming hostile fire. That's when the air in the room seemed to change. Dr. Hargrove entered the ER the way powerful men always entered rooms, as though the space had been waiting for him. His white coat was crisp, freshly pressed, the fabric so clean it probably still held the chemical smell of the dry cleaners. His name was embroidered below his title in letters that looked expensive. His eyes were the color of a corporate boardroom, pale blue, cold, the kind that assessed value and found most people wanting. He was 52, Elena guessed, the kind of man who had never once been told no by an institution that mattered. When his gaze landed on her at the nurse's station, something flickered across his face. Not recognition. Dismissal. You're the new charity hire. His voice carried across the ER the way a command officer's might, but without any of the earned weight. Just volume. Just the assumption that his words were important enough to interrupt the work of 6 other people at the station. Elena met his eyes with one measured breath. The kind of breath you took before entering a building you weren't sure would still be standing when you left it. She said nothing. Just held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked back at her monitor. Professional composure. The armor of invisibility. But Hargrove wasn't finished. He turned to the attending physicians gathering around the main desk, Dr. Patricia Chen, who'd been at Sacred Heart for 9 years and ran the trauma rotation like a well-oiled machine, Dr. Marcus Webb, younger, ambitious, always laughing at the right moment to climb the ladder, and Dr. Richard Alvarez, who kept his head down and his mouth shut except when it mattered. Hargrove had their attention now. He always did. I'm going to make a prediction, Hargrove said, his voice pitched to include everyone within 20 feet. And I want you all to hear this. This one, he gestured toward Elena with one open hand, dismissive as pointing at furniture, will be gone in a week. 10 days maximum. These charity hires never last. They come in thinking they're going to save the world, and then they realize the actual work requires more than soft hands and a heartfelt resume. The ER didn't go silent. It was too busy for that. But Elena felt the weight of it, the sudden awareness of her presence, the careful not looking of people who had just been given permission to judge her and were pretending they hadn't. Dr. Chen's jaw tightened. She knew better. She'd worked alongside Elena for exactly 3 shifts and had already learned that Elena's hands moved faster than most people's thoughts. But she said nothing. The hospital hierarchy was a ladder, and Hargrove was several rungs above everyone in this room. "I'm serious," Hargrove continued, now addressing the group like he was making a toast at a dinner party. "Who wants to bet? $20 says she quits within 7 days. Anyone? Come on. Easy money. Anyone want to take that action?" Dr. Webb laughed, the laugh of a man who had learned that laughter was the appropriate response to whatever his superiors found amusing. "I'm in," he said. "Though I'll give her 10 days. "Done," Hargrove said, and they shook hands across the desk like they'd just sealed something important. Elena didn't turn around. Her fingers continued moving across the keyboard, entering medication adjustments for Room 7, updating the status on a post-op abdominal case, pulling up lab results for a possible MI in Bay 3. Her face remained what it had been trained to be, present but unremarkable. The kind of face that people forgot 5 seconds after they stopped looking at it. But her hands were steady. Hands that had held arterial bleeds closed while mortars landed 200 meters away. Hands that had navigated through smoke and chaos and the screaming certainty of death closing in fast. Hands that knew how to work. The bet hung in the air like cigarette smoke, ugly and persistent. Around the ER, other staff members had heard it too. A phlebotomist avoiding eye contact. A respiratory therapist suddenly very interested in adjusting a ventilator. A patient care technician who abruptly needed to check on something in the supply closet. Elena finished her entries. She stood, her movements economical and precise, and walked toward the medication dispensary. Her left leg moved with perfect evenness. No compensation. Just the decision to walk without apology. As she passed Dr. Hargrove, she could feel the weight of him, his attention, his expectation that she would either crumble or respond. Either way, he could file her away and move on to something that actually mattered to him. The medication dispensary smelled of plastic and compressed air. Elena pulled up the digital list for her assigned patients, her eyes scanning the screen. But her mind was running a calculation that had nothing to do with medicine. 16 hours of double shifts meant her paycheck would keep her apartment rent paid for the next 2 months. She had benefits that covered her physical therapy for the old wound. She had a job at a hospital that hadn't asked her too many questions about the 15-year gap in her employment history that she could never explain. The kind of gap that happened when you were ordered to disappear by the Department of Defense. When your records were sealed. When your identity was buried under national security protocols so classified that even your family didn't know the truth. She had too much to lose to let a man like Hargrove matter. What happened next didn't just shake the hospital. It changed everything. But nobody knew that yet. Elena pulled the medication she needed, a vial of metoprolol for the MI case, an antibiotic drip for post-op infection prevention, a dose of morphine for the woman in Bay 2 who'd shattered her femur in a car accident. The plastic caps came off. The syringes drew the medicine into their barrels. One by one. Methodical. The way she'd been trained to do things when there were no second takes, no room for error, no chance to redo a decision that had already cost lives. Behind her, Dr. Hargrove was still laughing with Dr. Webb, a private joke forming between them about the new hire who wouldn't make it a week. About the woman with soft hands and immigrant optimism and absolutely no idea what real medicine required. Elena walked back to the ER with the medications, and every person she passed seemed to avoid looking at her. This was the thing about hospitals. They were full of smart people who had learned to recognize power when it entered a room and to stand on the side of it that wouldn't hurt them. She didn't blame them. She'd worked in far worse hierarchies. The MI case in Bay 3 was a 64-year-old man named Raymond Delacroix, his EKG showing the distinctive elevation that meant his left anterior descending artery had closed off. Tissue death in real time. The morphine would ease his pain while they got him upstairs to cardiology for a potential stent. Elena moved to his bedside with the same competence she would have shown if Hargrove had never opened his mouth. "Raymond," she said, her voice steady and professional, "I'm going to get you something for the pain now. You're going to feel a little pinch, and then you should start feeling better." "Thank you," he whispered. His wife sat beside him, her hand on his chest, terrified in a way that money and insurance and every modern medical marvel couldn't prevent. Elena inserted the fall line with one smooth motion. No hesitation. No tremor. The needle found the vein, and she depressed the plunger. The morphine entered his bloodstream, and his face softened almost immediately. The fear didn't leave, but the sharp edge of it dulled. "Okay," Elena said. "You're going to be okay. Cardiology is on their way." She meant it. Not because she believed medical outcomes were guaranteed. She knew better than that. But because she had done this before, in places where the alternative to okay was dead, and she had learned to project confidence the way a general projected calm. It was a form of authority. Earned authority. The kind that didn't need to announce itself. An hour passed. Hargrove made his rounds, his white coat trailing behind him like a cape. He didn't speak to Elena. Didn't acknowledge her. Which was its own kind of power play, the power of people who could make you invisible by simply refusing to see you. That night, when Elena drove home to her apartment in Ghent, her hands gripped the steering wheel so hard the knuckles went white. Her old wound ached with the kind of pain that came from tension and weather and the memory of what had put it there. She thought about Hargrove's hands shaking with webs over that stupid $20 bet. She thought about the attention suddenly on her. The judgment. The assumption. But when she got home, she didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She didn't sit in the dark processing injustice. Instead, she made a cup of tea and read through patient charts for the next morning's shifts, and she opened her locker in her mind and touched those worn combat boots one more time. The ritual that kept her centered. The ritual that said, you have carried heavier things than his ego. You have been to places his mind couldn't follow. You have done things his imagination cannot contain. 7 days, he'd said. She would still be here on day 8. She would be here far longer than that. The wheelchair rolled through Sacred Heart's emergency department doors at 7:36 a.m. on a Tuesday, pushed by a VA transport aide whose name tag read Thompson. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen sat rigid in the chair, his paralyzed legs covered by a thin wool blanket, his hands gripping the armrests like they might disappear if he let go. Elena was restocking the trauma bay supply cart when she heard the wheels squeaking against the polished floor. She turned. Her clipboard fell. It clattered against the tile with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet morning ward. The boy, no, the man, sitting before her was 20 years older, heavier through the shoulders, but his eyes were exactly the same. Dark. Intelligent. Haunted in a way that only came from seeing things that hadn't been meant for a 9-year-old to see. She knew those eyes because she'd looked into them in a burning Humvee in the Jolan district of Tikrit while rounds punched through metal and the building around them was coming down in sections. She'd pulled him from the wreckage, this boy, the interpreter's son who'd been in the wrong place when sectarian violence erupted around the compound. She'd carried him 6 miles through enemy territory with his small hands locked around her neck and his breath hot against her ear, whispering prayers in Arabic and English. The Marines had called her Viper because she moved like one, silent, deadly, never giving the enemy a chance to strike back. That extraction had cost her 3 bullets, 2 scar tissue patches on her left leg, and eventually, her entire identity. After Syria, after the Black Ops mission that had killed her husband Daniel and scattered the rest of the team across 3 continents, naval intelligence had ordered her to disappear. They'd erased her records, buried her name under national security protocols so deep that even the Pentagon couldn't excavate it. She'd become a ghost. And now the ghost was looking at a man who shouldn't be a man yet, a child who'd grown up in the years she'd spent pretending not to exist. Elena's hands moved on their own, walking her toward the wheelchair. Her voice came out carefully measured, each word a brick in a wall she was building between then and now. "Good morning, Sergeant. Welcome to Sacred Heart. I'm Elena, one of the floor nurses. Let's get you settled in exam room 3. She didn't ask his name. She already knew it. She'd probably whispered it 1,000 times in her sleep, during the nightmares where the Humvee exploded and she was still inside it, still trapped with his small body pressed against hers. Thompson pushed the wheelchair down the corridor. Marcus kept staring back at her. His mouth moved like he wanted to say something, but the VA aide was already talking about intake paperwork and insurance verification, and the moment collapsed like a building under demolition. Elena picked up her clipboard and followed them into the examination room, keeping her distance, keeping her hands busy with vital sign monitors and portable oxygen tanks and anything that would require her to look down instead of into his face. She checked his breathing first. The stethoscope was cold against his chest, and his heartbeat came steady and strong, tachycardic at 92 beats per minute, probably anxiety, probably the disruption of routine that hospital admissions always brought. She wrote down the numbers. 92, normal respiratory rate, 16 breaths. SpO2 at 98% on room air. The data was clean. The patient was healthy, given that half his body had been permanently converted into a collection of nerve endings that could no longer command the muscles below his waist. "Your vitals look good, Sergeant," she said, maintaining the professional distance of a stranger. "Any pain right now? Numbness? Tingling in the lower extremities?" "No," he said, and his voice carried that same formality that military men learned in basic training, the kind of respect that was automatic and came with or without gratitude. "But he paused. "Do I know you from somewhere?" Elena's jaw tightened. She finished writing her notes before answering. "I don't think so. I'm sure we haven't met, Sergeant." "Your voice," he said quietly. "I know your voice from somewhere. Not from here. From before." She couldn't answer that. The words were right there in her throat, trapped behind 20 years of regulations and national security advisories and the ghost of her husband who died in Syria so that men like Marcus Chen could keep living. So she said nothing, just pressed the pulse oximetry sensor onto his finger and watched the number climb to 99, watched the graph line spike and fall in perfect rhythm. The fluorescent lights above them buzzed with the sound of electricity held in temporary suspension, and Elena realized that this moment, this exact moment, was the hinge on which everything would turn. The door opened. Dr. Hargrove filled the frame like a storm system moving in from the Atlantic, his white coat pressed to a surgical crease, his badge clipped to his chest with the weight of 7 Ivy League letters and 3 generations of inherited authority. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at Elena the way a man might look at a stain on his expensive shirt, something that needed removing. "I'll take it from here," he said. It wasn't a request. It was the kind of command that expected immediate compliance and punished hesitation. Elena stepped back, her hands at her sides, her face the careful blank slate she'd learned to maintain over 20 years of being invisible. But as she passed Hargrove in the doorway, he moved. Later, she wouldn't be sure if it was intentional or just the careless momentum of a man accustomed to taking up space in the world without asking permission. His shoulder caught her as she turned, and he didn't slow down. Didn't acknowledge her. Just kept moving forward into the exam room while Elena stumbled slightly, catching herself against the door frame. In the hallway, her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something else. Something that felt like pressure building behind her ribs, like she was learning to breathe in a new way. She walked to the break room and poured herself a cup of coffee that had been sitting since 5 a.m. and tasted like burnt rubber and betrayal. She was drinking it when the overhead speakers crackled and a voice said Dr. Hargrove to the nurse's station, and Elena decided that maybe the coffee was fine. Maybe bitter was the only thing that made sense anymore. The cafeteria at 11:30 was crowded with the lunch shift, nurses from the ICU, residents from the surgery floor, respiratory therapists who worked the night rotation and had come back early for the free annual staff meeting. Elena sat at a corner table with a cup of soup that she wasn't eating and a turkey sandwich that tasted like cardboard treated with formaldehyde. She was thinking about Marcus's question, "Do I know you from somewhere?" The answer was yes. The answer was that she'd known him when he was small enough to carry, when his weight had been nothing against her body armor, when she'd run through a war zone with his life in her hands like a prayer. She was thinking about telling him, breaking every regulation and every restriction that had been placed on her by people in offices she'd never seen, when Hargrove walked past. He didn't slow down. He didn't look at her. His hip caught the edge of her tray at precisely the moment when the soup was closest to the edge of the table, and suddenly Elena's lunch was airborne, bowl and spoon and sloshing liquid making a perfect arc through the cafeteria. It hit the floor about 3 feet away, splashing across the tile in a pattern that looked like something broken. The room went dead silent. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward her. Hargrove kept walking. Over his shoulder, he said, "Oops. Sorry, sweetheart. Didn't see you there." He smiled at the doctors sitting at his table, and 3 of them smiled back. Elena knelt to clean it up. An orderly rushed over with paper towels, but she shook her head. "No, I'll do it," and she did it herself while the room watched. Her hands were steady. That was the important thing. Her hands didn't shake because her hands had learned not to shake during a medical evac in Kandahar, during a hostage rescue in Aleppo, during the Black Ops extraction in Syria where half her team had gone in and only 4 had come out. Her hands had learned that trembling was a luxury for people who weren't responsible for keeping others alive. So she knelt and she picked up the pieces of her lunch and she pressed paper towels against the spill and she didn't look at anyone's face, didn't acknowledge the weight of all those stares. This was humiliation, she understood. This was what Hargrove had promised in the parking lot 2 days ago when he'd said he'd make sure she was gone by Friday. This was just the beginning. She threw the mess away and went back to the ward. She had patient charts to update. She had Marcus Chen's vitals to record in his file. She had work to do, and work was the thing that had kept her alive for 20 years, the thing that let her pretend she wasn't watching the clock tick backward to a moment she couldn't undo and a boy she couldn't save twice. She was at the supply closet organizing sterile gauze packets when Hargrove appeared in the doorway. He had her patient charts in his hands, the 3 files she'd been working on, the documentation on Marcus, the paperwork on 2 post-op recovery patients. He didn't hand them to her. He threw them at her feet, paper scattering across the tile floor like confetti at a funeral. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. His voice had the texture of something sharp. "Maybe if you spent less time daydreaming and more time learning actual medicine, you'd be worth the pity higher." Elena took one measured breath. The kind of breath they taught you to take when your heart rate was spiking and your adrenaline was flooding and you needed to think clearly enough to make decisions that would keep people alive. One breath. Then she let a single tear escape down her cheek. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, without looking away from him, and she said quietly, "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, doctor." He leaned close. "I'll make sure you're gone by Friday." She didn't respond. She knelt and gathered the charts, stacking them back into order, feeling his presence above her like a storm system moving in from the Atlantic. When she looked up, he was already turning away, already moving back into the hallway where doctors waited and patients needed attention and the world continued turning on its axis as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Something was about to change. She could feel it the way you could feel the pressure drop before a hurricane hit the coastline. That afternoon, when she returned to the trauma bay to check the monitors, she found Marcus in a wheelchair near the window, looking out at Norfolk's harbor where Navy ships sat in rows like sleeping sharks. She wheeled past his line of sight, but he caught her wrist. "Your voice," he whispered. "I know your voice. You sound like my savior." Elena froze. She couldn't speak. She couldn't turn around. She could only feel the pressure of his hand on her wrist, warm and alive and impossible, and in that moment she understood that the war she'd left behind 20 years ago had followed her into this hospital, into this moment, and there was no escape velocity powerful enough to leave it behind. The morning light filtered through the hospital windows in thin, pale bars. Elena was reviewing Marcus's chart outside Bay 4 when she heard the sound, a sharp, gasping inhalation followed by silence. Not the silence of rest. The silence of suffocation. She moved before her conscious mind caught up. 12 years of field medicine does that. Your body remembers what your brain tries to forget. Marcus sat upright in his hospital bed, his face already going the color of old concrete. His chest heaved but no air was moving on the left side. She could hear the asymmetrical breath sounds from across the room. His oxygen saturation was dropping in real time on the monitor. 92, 88, 85. His lips had started to turn blue at the edges. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space with nowhere to go, collapsing his right lung, pressing against his heart. 3 minutes. Maybe 4. That was the window between this moment and cardiac arrest. Elena grabbed a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart, her movements fluid and automatic, the muscle memory of 100 field hospitals in Fallujah and Sanjin Valley moving through her hands like water. She didn't think. She moved. The needle was already in her grip when Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. Step away from that patient. Now. He was standing in the doorway, his face already flushed. Not from concern. From something else. Something that looked like anger looking for an excuse. His left lung is collapsing, Elena said, her voice level, factual. Tension pneumothorax. I need to decompress. You need to wait for the trauma surgeon. Hargrove moved into the bay with the authority of a man who had never been told no. You don't have authorization for invasive procedures. You're a nurse, Martinez. Act like one. Marcus's oxygen sat dropped to 82. His eyes were wide and terrified, his mouth open like a fish pulled from water. A thin strand of saliva connected his lower lip to his chin. 3 minutes, Elena said. She didn't move. 2.5 if his BP drops any further. I don't care if he has 2 seconds. You touch him and I'll have your license revoked before the paperwork hits the printer. Hargrove stepped closer, his voice dropping to something that sounded almost intimate. You want to keep your job? You'll stand down. You'll wait. And you'll pray the surgeon gets here in time. Elena looked at Marcus. Really looked at him. Not the paralyzed veteran in the bed, but the terrified 9-year-old she'd carried through enemy territory 20 years ago, the boy whose weight in her arms had been the only thing keeping her moving when her legs wanted to stop. His lips were purple now. His fingers were clawing at the bedsheet. She'd made her choice the moment she'd picked him up in Tikrit. That choice didn't end just because he'd grown up. It didn't end just because a man with a title and a power complex decided it should. Elena moved. She positioned the needle at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the space between his ribs where medical textbooks said the air should escape. Hargrove lunged forward, his hand coming up to shove her aside, and for one suspended moment Elena felt his palm strike her shoulder with the force of all his accumulated arrogance and rage. She stumbled, caught herself on the bed rail, and kept moving. The needle slid in. There was resistance, then a sudden give, and then the hiss. That specific, unmistakable sound of pressurized air escaping. Like opening a soda bottle that had been shaken, like the valve on a pressure cooker releasing, like 18 years of held breath finally being allowed to exist in the world. Marcus gasped. Real air moved into his lungs. His chest expanded. Color flooded back into his face like sunrise spreading across water. The monitor's oxygen saturation climbed, 85. 88, 91. 94. Sinus rhythm on the display. Strong. Steady. Alive. Hargrove's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession. Shock. Disbelief. Then something far more dangerous, the look of a man who had just realized his control was an illusion and was having to decide whether to accept it or burn it all down. He chose fire. His voice when he spoke was so quiet Elena almost didn't hear it, but the residents and nurses in the surrounding bays fell silent as if he'd shouted. The fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz louder in the sudden absence of human sound. You're done, he said. Not a question. Not a discussion. You just violated hospital protocol, circumvented medical authority, and performed an invasive procedure without licensing in your scope of practice. You're done. Elena withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it. She set it on the bedside table. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Everything about her was steady because everything inside her was made of combat steel, and she'd learned a long time ago not to show weakness to men who mistook it for permission. "He was dying," she said. "And now we'll see whose license gets buried first, won't we?" Hargrove turned on his heel, his white coat billowing behind him like a cape. "Expect a formal call from administration within the hour. You're suspended pending investigation." He left. The room exhaled. The residents scattered back to their charts like startled birds. Elena checked Marcus's vitals one more time. 98% oxygen saturation. Heart rate 94. Blood pressure climbing back toward normal. She adjusted his oxygen mask and smoothed the wrinkles from his bedsheet with movements that had no purpose beyond the movement itself. Her hands needed something to do besides feel the weight of what was coming. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it started a chain reaction that would shake Sacred Heart's foundation. Within 30 minutes, Hargrove's network activated with the precision of a professional destruction system. He called Arthur Bennett, the hospital board chairman and his golfing buddy of 17 years. 37 minutes later, he filed a formal complaint with the state nursing board, alleging negligence and scope of practice violation. He contacted the hospital director's office. Then he did something colder and more calculated than any of it, he called her references. Elena's employment history had exactly 3 references before Sacred Heart. One was a physician at a clinic in San Diego who had closed 15 years ago. One was a community health center in Chicago where nobody worked anymore who could verify her credentials. And one was a contact number that didn't ring anymore because it had never existed outside of classified government documentation. Hargrove couldn't reach any of them. But that was the point. Their absence was itself an accusation. By 3 p.m., Elena was called to the HR office on the 5th floor. By 4 p.m., she was walking out of Sacred Heart's main entrance with her personal items in a cardboard box that weighed almost nothing despite containing the only physical evidence that she'd existed in this hospital for the past 3 months. Her badge had been taken. Her credentials suspended pending an external investigation. By 4:51 p.m., she was standing in the rain at Arlington Cemetery, at a grave marked with a name that wasn't hers and a rank that nobody alive could verify. Her hands pressed against the wet stone and she let the rain fill her eyes so it looked like anything but tears. "I saved that boy twice, Daniel," she whispered to the grave of her late husband, a fellow operator who had died on the same Black Ops extraction in Syria that had erased her from official existence. "And I still can't save myself from their small, cruel world." The rain hammered down like applause. And then her phone rang. The phone call came at 11:56 p.m., while Elena sat in her car in the Sacred Heart parking lot, her hand still steady on the steering wheel even though every nerve ending was screaming. The text message first, suspension effective immediately. Report to HR tomorrow at 0800 for briefing. Then another. Under investigation for credential fraud and unauthorized medical procedures. Then another. Your employment record is under external review. Dr. Hargrove had moved faster than she'd anticipated. She'd given him an opening, one moment of protocol violation, one emergency procedure she'd performed without waiting for his approval, and he'd weaponized it with the precision of someone who'd been planning this since day one. It wasn't about Marcus anymore. It wasn't about saving a life. It was about power, about the fact that she'd made him look small in front of his staff, and there were some men who would burn down a hospital just to prove they were still the biggest person in the room. She'd pulled the file from our shared drive before leaving the floor, reading the email chain on her phone. Hargrove had contacted every reference she'd listed, every hospital where she'd worked in the past 7 years. He'd insinuated that her nursing license was fraudulent. He'd hired a private investigator named Gregory Walls, $3,500 retainer, according to the email CC'd to the hospital director, to trace her employment history. He'd flagged the 15-year gap in her resume, the years when she didn't exist on any payroll, any tax return, any official documentation. Those were the years when she'd been extracted from the world entirely, when her name and face had been erased by national security protocols so classified that even now, 2 decades later, she couldn't explain them to anyone. The investigator's preliminary report was in the file. cannot locate records for employment 2004 to 2019. Likely fraudulent claims. Recommend immediate termination and criminal referral. Hargrove had circled that sentence in red and forwarded it to the hospital director with the note, "This is who we hired. A criminal. I move to press charges." Elena drove toward Arlington's Overflow Cemetery, the one outside Norfolk where the headstones were packed tight as teeth. Rain started on the beltline, drumming against the windshield in steady percussion. She didn't need to check the GPS. She'd been here exactly 4 times in 18 years, once on each anniversary of Daniel's death. The cemetery gates were closed, but they never locked the pedestrian entrance. Elena walked through mud and wet grass, her work shoes squelching with each step, until she found the grave marked simply, Daniel M. Martinez, 1971 to 2004, beloved husband and father, U.S. Navy SEAL. There was no indication of what had really happened, no mention that he died on a Black Ops extraction mission so secret that even his daughter didn't know the truth. The Navy had called it a training accident. A parachute malfunction in Syria. They'd given Elena a folded flag and a pension she couldn't touch without triggering an investigation, and they'd told her that if she ever spoke about what really happened, her daughter would lose her security clearance and her career prospects would evaporate. Elena knelt in the rain, her knees sinking into the muddy grass. The combat boots were still in her locker at Sacred Heart, the pair Daniel had worn on 18 operations, the pair she'd kept in a gym bag for 19 years like a talisman. She had his combat badge in her pocket, the one he'd worn the day they extracted the hostages from Tikrit, the day she'd pulled a terrified 9-year-old boy from a burning Humvee while Daniel covered their extraction with suppressive fire from a rooftop 200 meters away. That same boy was now in a hospital bed because an IED had taken his legs, and Elena had saved him once again, and it hadn't mattered because Hargrove had destroyed her in less than 4 hours. "I saved that boy twice, Daniel," she whispered, her voice cracking in a way that shocked her. She never let her voice crack. She never let herself break. But the rain was loud enough that only God could hear, and she was so tired. Once in Tikrit. Once yesterday. And I still can't save myself from their small, cruel world. She pressed her forehead against the wet granite, and for the first time in 20 years, she let herself cry. Not the controlled tear of a warrior, but real tears, the kind that came from someone who'd spent 2 decades carrying the weight of a ghost and a secret in the face of a child she'd been ordered to forget. The rain fell harder, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed toward the highway. Elena sat there for 32 minutes, counting her breaths the way she'd been trained, in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4, until her nervous system had no choice but to return to baseline. Until the soldier in her reasserted control over the woman. At 1:13 a.m., she drove back to Sacred Heart. The night shift was thin, just the trauma team, the ICU nurses, and the skeleton crew that kept the hospital breathing in the dark hours. She used her badge to access the staff area, moved through empty hallways that smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion, and opened her locker. Her personal items took 90 seconds to pack, a photo of her daughter at her graduation, a change of clothes, and the combat boots. She held them against her chest like they were the only real thing left in her life. In Marcus's room, she found him awake. He was staring out the window at the rain, his face illuminated by the grey pre-dawn light, and he looked so young. That was the thing about trauma that nobody mentioned, it aged you and de-aged you simultaneously. Marcus had the body of someone who'd been broken, but his face still held the round cheeks of boyhood. "You remember me," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elena stopped in the doorway. She said nothing. "The lady with the dragon tattoo on your arm," Marcus continued, his eyes still on the rain. "You came to me in the dark, and you had a rifle, and you told me to be quiet. You said you were going to carry me to safety, and I needed to close my eyes and think about my mother's cooking, because if I thought about good things, the fear couldn't take root." He paused. "You sang to me in Arabic. Your accent was terrible, but you sang anyway. You said my father had taught you that song, that he was a good man, that he would be proud of how brave I was being." Elena's hands trembled. For the first time in 2 decades, they trembled. She locked her jaw against it. You told me stories for 6 miles, Marcus said, finally turning to look at her. About your daughter. You said her name was Sophia and she wanted to be a doctor, and you were going to teach her to be brave like me. You said that being brave didn't mean not being scared, it meant doing the right thing anyway, even when every cell in your body was screaming to run. Don't, Elena said quietly. I remember your voice, Marcus continued. Not the words so much as the feeling of it. Like whatever you said, I was going to be okay. Like you wouldn't let anything happen to me because you were the kind of person who didn't break promises. Elena set the boots down carefully on the chair. I can't confirm any of this. Do you understand? If I acknowledge what you're saying, if I admit that I was in Tikrit, if I confirm anything about what happened that day, I become a liability. The investigation, Hargrove, is looking for any reason to have me arrested. The protocols that allowed me to disappear, that kept me safe all these years, they require absolute secrecy. I don't exist on paper, Marcus. Officially, I never saved you. I was never there. Then why do I remember? Marcus asked. Elena had no answer. She picked up the combat boots again and walked out of his room. At 7:56 a.m., she sat in the hospital's small conference room with 4 men in suits and Dr. Hargrove, who was smiling like a man who'd already won. The lead investigator was Gregory Walls, the private investigator Hargrove had hired. He had thin lips and eyes like a hawk, and he was holding a folder with her name on it. Or rather, the name she'd been using for 7 years. Ms. Martinez, Walls began, we've been unable to locate any employment records prior to 2019. No W-2 forms, no Social Security withholdings, no tax returns, no nursing licenses in any database. It's as if you didn't exist before you arrived at Norfolk Regional in 2019. Elena said nothing. Your hire date, Hargrove interjected, was contingent on a background check. The agency we used reported finding no criminal record, but clearly their investigation was incomplete. I'm requesting that we escalate this to federal authorities for credential fraud investigation. I didn't falsify anything, Elena said. Her voice was steady now, stone steady, because the grief had crystallized into something harder. Every credential I provided was legitimate. Can you explain the employment gap? Walls asked. Elena looked at him with the kind of calm that only comes from having survived things that would break ordinary people. No. Can you provide previous employers who can verify your work history? No. Can you provide any documentation from the years 2004 to 2019? Elena thought about the classified files locked in Pentagon safes. The extraction reports that had been sealed under national security orders. The redacted commendations that would never appear in her personnel file. The daughter she'd raised alone, the husband she'd buried in secret, the lives she'd saved in places that didn't officially exist. No, she said again. Dr. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, satisfied. The evidence suggests intentional fraud in the hiring process. I move for immediate termination and criminal referral. The hospital administrator, a man named Richard Chen who'd never made eye contact with Elena in the 3 years she'd worked at Sacred Heart, nodded slowly. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending investigation. Your nursing license is flagged with the state board. You are barred from hospital premises except to retrieve personal property with HR supervision. He paused, and his voice dropped. I'm sorry. But the evidence is compelling. Elena stood up. She'd been fired before, it was her 3rd termination letter in 7 years, always the same reason, the unexplainable gap, the records that didn't exist, the past that was legally forbidden to defend. She picked up her bag, the one with the combat boots inside, and walked toward the door. That was when she heard the helicopters. The sound came first. A low thump in the distance that grew into a percussion of rotors beating against Norfolk's grey morning sky. 3 black SUVs rolled past the ER entrance, tires hissing on wet asphalt, their doors opening with synchronized precision. Federal plates. No hospital markings. No civilian insignias. A UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter descended towards Sacred Heart's helipad, the rotor wash hammering windows hard enough to rattle the trauma bay monitors. Elena stood frozen in the hallway, her bag still in her hands, the worn combat boots inside caked with sand and memory from a desert she was never supposed to mention again. A SEAL team leader strode through the ER doors like the room had been waiting for his permission to exist. His uniform was dress blues, ribbon stacked precise as a deck of cards, the kind of bearing that made conversation stop mid-sentence. Behind him came 3 other operators, their movements fluid and certain, the kind of certainty that comes from having survived things that shouldn't survive. The SEAL commander's eye swept the trauma bay once and locked on Elena. Senior Chief Martinez. Not a question. Not a request. A call sign activation. A voice like a submarine sonar cutting through water, deep, unambiguous, searching for exactly one target. Viper? The hallway went silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence of recognition spreading like electricity through gathered staff. Every eye moved to Elena, who stood motionless, her bag against her leg, her face betraying nothing. She didn't nod. Didn't speak. Didn't cry. She let the silence confirm what 18 years of classified protocols had forbidden her to speak. Yes, sir. 2 words. 8 years of separation. 2 continents. 1 identity destroyed and rebuilt and buried again. The SEAL commander's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the weight of understanding exactly what she'd sacrificed to disappear. The hospital administrator appeared from his office like a man walking toward his own execution. His hands were shaking. In them, a manila folder sealed with red security stamps and classified designation marks that hadn't seen daylight in 18 years. His voice cracked as he opened it, as if the file itself was radioactive. This says. He stopped. Swallowed hard. His fingers trembled turning the first page. Navy Cross. Distinguished Service Medal. 2 silver stars. He looked up at Elena, then back at the file. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. This is a Navy Cross. That's, after the Medal of Honor, that's the 2nd highest. Keep reading, the SEAL commander said quietly. The administrator's hand shook worse as he turned the next page. 3 bronze stars with Valor. Combat Action Ribbon. Meritorious Service Medal. Joint Service Commendation. This says. He stopped again, his eye scanning the same line twice, 3 times, as if the words kept changing and he needed to verify them each time. This says Navy Cross for the Tikrit extraction. For extracting 8 hostages from a burning compound under sustained fire. Alone. He looked at Elena. Actually looked at her, not at the nurse in scrubs, but at the person standing in front of him. You went back in. Twice, the SEAL commander said. He stepped forward and placed his hand on Elena's shoulder, the gesture formal and heavy with finality. 3 bronze stars with Valor. 1 for operations in Fallujah. 1 for Helmand Province. 1 for a classified operation in Syria 18 years ago that just got declassified. And she was operating under protected operational status for 18 years. Every record sealed. Every reference deleted. Every career prior to this hospital erased by JSOC and the National Security Agency to protect an active intelligence asset. Dr. Hargrove was nowhere visible. But somewhere in this building, he was listening. Somewhere in this building, his phone was buzzing with messages from the board chairman who suddenly didn't remember their golf games. Messages from the investigators he'd hired, now realizing their client had sent them after a federal shadow operative. Messages from the hospital director telling him to surrender his credentials immediately. An FBI agent appeared at the ER entrance, not in a suit but in the kind of tactical gear that said this wasn't an investigation anymore, this was a federal arrest. Behind her came a second agent carrying evidence boxes containing Hargrove's office computers, his phone records, his calendar of calls made to discredit a senior chief petty officer of the United States Navy. Dr. Richard Hargrove, the agent said, her voice cutting through the hallway like a blade. You're under arrest for attempted fraud against federal military records, conspiracy to obstruct a protected intelligence asset, and filing false complaints against a federal operative. The calls you made to verify her background triggered a counterintelligence investigation. Every phone record, every conversation, every attempt to destroy her credibility is now evidence of a federal crime. The handcuffs snapped shut with the sound of finality. White metal against white skin. His white coat came off in the hallway. A detention center jumpsuit replaced it. His eyes, those eyes that had held such contempt for her just 48 hours ago, now held nothing but the flat shock of a man watching his entire life collapse simultaneously. Someone's phone was recording. Multiple phones, actually. The moment he walked past the cafeteria where he'd knocked her lunch tray to the floor, where he'd thrown her charts at her feet like she was garbage, multiple cameras captured it. His face ashen. His jaw slack. His hands in federal custody. By evening, that footage was on every staff member's phone. By the next morning, it had reached the state medical board. By the end of the week, every hospital in Norfolk knew that Dr. Richard Hargrove's medical license was suspended pending trial on federal charges. By month's end, his name was in the Journal of the American Medical Association in an article about physician-perpetrated harassment and obstruction. The board chairman who'd golfed with him every Tuesday suddenly couldn't recall their friendship. The hospital director who'd allowed the suspension now held a press conference celebrating Elena's return to full duty. The investigators Hargrove had hired discovered they'd been working for a man committing federal crimes and turned state's evidence immediately. His conviction took 14 months. His sentence was 18 months federal prison. His release brought him to a Norfolk strip mall to sell insurance from a folding table, his hands making cold calls to people who had no idea they were being sold to by a disgraced physician who'd tried to murder a fellow operative through bureaucratic destruction. But that wasn't on Elena's mind as she stood in the ER hallway while the SEAL commander embraced her, his expression showing something that looked like pride mixed with deep understanding. A woman in a business suit pushed through the gathered crowd, tears streaming down her face. She was in her 30s now, composed and powerful in the way of someone who'd spent their adult life fighting on Capitol Hill. She was a congresswoman on the Armed Services Committee. She was also the 14-year-old girl Elena had carried 6 miles through enemy territory in Tikrit, a senator's daughter who'd been hidden in that compound for 4 weeks before Elena went back in twice to extract her. "You carried me," the congresswoman whispered. "I was 14 years old and terrified, and you carried me out of that compound and took 3 bullets doing it. I've been looking for you for 18 years. Elena touched her left arm where the scars still ran white and permanent, still ached when the weather changed, still carried the memory of shrapnel and adrenaline and the weight of a child who'd clung to her like anchor points to life. "I remember you," Elena said simply. "I know you do." The congresswoman stepped back, wiping her eyes. "I sponsored legislation in your name. The Senior Chief Martinez Veteran Transition Program. Congress unanimously passed it. It funds 17 transition programs across the country now. Because of you. Because you came back for me." 2 years later, Norfolk's morning sun caught the windows of Sacred Heart Hospital and turned them gold. Elena sat at her desk in the corner office overlooking the harbor, the office of the director of the Veteran Care Unit. On the desk sat her pair of worn combat boots, caked with Tikrit sand and ancient memory, placed carefully beside a framed photograph of a 9-year-old Iraqi boy she'd saved twice and the silver badge of her senior chief petty officer rank that she could finally wear in the open. Her uniform hung in her office, decorations gleaming in the light, the medals arranged in descending order from left to right, the Navy Cross at the far left, second only to the Medal of Honor, a quiet reminder of what she'd done in darkness so that others could live in light. Marcus Chen arrived at 7 in the morning, his wheelchair pushing forward with the power and grace of a man who'd transformed his disability into purpose. He was her patient advocate now, connecting broken warriors with the resources and medical care they needed to find their way back. His desk was next to Elena's. Their partnership had become the model for veteran-centered care facilities across the country. A young Marine came into the ER that morning with eyes hollow from PTSD, trembling hands, and the 1,000-yard stare that Elena recognized immediately, the look of someone who'd seen things that wouldn't let them sleep. Elena walked into the quiet room and sat across from him, her ribbons visible, her badge visible, her presence communicating something that no pamphlet or insurance card could convey. "I know where you've been," she said quietly. "I know what you've seen. And I know the way back." He looked at her decorations, the weight of them, the authenticity of them. "You really know?" "I really know," Elena said. "You're going to get through this. And when you do, there's work to be done. Operators need people who understand. People who've been there. I'll be here when you're ready." Something in his eyes shifted. Not hope, exactly. Something older than hope, the recognition that someone who'd walked through the same darkness understood where the light was hidden. Somewhere in a Norfolk strip mall, a failed doctor made another cold call to sell another policy, his voice hollow, his name meaning nothing to anyone anymore. Somewhere in Sacred Heart Hospital, a senior chief petty officer saved another life. And somewhere in the country, 17 veteran transition programs carried her name, carrying forward the work of bringing broken warriors home. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. Hit like if this story got you. And tell me, have you ever been underestimated at work, only to prove them all wrong? I read every comment. Subscribe if you haven't already.